am ready.
You're ready.
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for popping down. This is our first pop-up book signing in a long time. It sort of just came up, so I thank you all for taking a little time out of your busy Friday evening to come and join us. So I'm sure you can work out that this is Brad, and this is Jamie over here, who has not been to the store before, but Brad has been here a lot.
This will be the 15th time.
That's right. All of
Because it's
his
a pop-up.
We've been lucky. We've actually launched all of Brad's books. We did in January, which was fun, and then spent another time or two in between, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which
Yeah,
is why I know he's wearing his only garment
this
for
is
book
the author
events.
jacket.
This is his.
Comes out once a year.
So one of these days. No, I did meet up with you in New York. One of these days, I'm going to come to Charleston or something and see you in like other clothes.
Yeah, I've turned into. I've told my wife I'm going to be like Steve Jobs and wear the same thing every day. So I have this 511 shirt. I've got like 5 of them now. I'm going to have like 20 of them before I'm done. So I wear the same shirt every day. Don't have to worry about it.
Wow, I'm taking notes.
Save a lot of time, right?
Yeah. So then, we always fight about I'm coming in. I'm going to Poison Pen. What are you going to wear? I'm going to wear that. You're not wearing that, are you? Yes, I am wearing that. So I'm saying, all right. I'm just going to wear the same shirt everywhere I go. Just like Steve Jobs, worked for him.
So is this jacket you wore when you were on active service?
No, not at all. This was a gift from my wife, actually. And I actually, believe it or not, I had to take my very first author picture, which at that time, since I was a nobody, the publisher wasn't paying for it. So I had a buddy of mine who's a professional photographer, and she bought this jacket and then took a bunch of pictures, and that's what ended up on One Rough Man, the original
Right.
book. And I've had it ever since, but I only wear it once a year, so it doesn't wear out. Although I had it refurbished. It was like $200 to refurbish this thing, and I was like, $200? What are you going to do to it? And the guy pulled me aside and said, actually, if you get some brown shoe polish, you can do it yourself. That's what I did. Got some brown shoe polish and did the whole thing, hung it out to dry, and it looks pretty good.
Hey, come on, you were in the Army, Lieutenant Colonel like you didn't have anybody to shine your stuff?
No, so actually the brown shoe polish worked really well. I need to do it again, but saved me $200, I'll tell you that.
Oh, there's an introduction. So, Jamie, it's wonderful to have you here in Scottsdale. I was explaining that we had been up at Brandeis where you and Brad were part of a lunch, the annual book and author lunch.
Just earlier today.
Right.
Yes. It was a monster event. There were like over 900 people there.
And
Stunning.
it appeared that you had music and possibly video clips, but I was outside and not able to see it.
Oh, you missed it. Oh.
I know, heartbreak.
Well, sure. I mean, my book is about growing up with having Leonard Bernstein for a father. So it's a description of, my life in my family. And so today, I just spoke briefly, but I included a clip from one of my dad's young people's concerts that used to be on television. I don't know how many of you saw those on TV back in the day, when he would conduct the New York Philharmonic and he would explain about the music that he was performing with them. And then he would go to the piano and do little musical examples. Do you remember?
Yes.
So I showed a little clip from one of these young people's concerts where he was explaining about sonata form, and to explain about the form, he went to the piano and sang a Beatles song. And I was a Beatlemaniac beyond the calculating. So for me, I thought it was just the funniest thing in the world that my dad was singing a Beatles song. And it's still pretty funny, and I love sharing it with audiences.
I actually had a question that when I saw the clip, were you the same age as the children that were in the clip, or were you older?
I was pretty much that age. I would have been like, 13, 14, something. 13, yeah, right about the same age.
Yeah, the camera panned out to a bunch of kids out in the audience, and they were all going crazy because he's playing the Beatles. And when you had mentioned that you were a child when that happened, I thought, I wonder if she's the same age as the people in it.
Yeah, I think I was 12 or 13, so I was just right in it, right in the middle of it.
I thought your dad was really good about, making music more and more accessible.
Well, that's what he was all about.
He was.
He loved all kinds of music, and he wanted to tear the walls down between the different kinds of music, both in terms of talking about it and embracing it, and also when it came to composing music himself. His, symphonic works were jazzy, and his Broadway scores were symphonic, and, he would just mix it all up.
So reading your book, I was really fascinated by the people that you got to hang out with besides your father. I especially liked your comments about Stephen Sondheim and his great verbal facility. He must have been fabulous to have around, just for the verbal fireworks.
He was an amazing character. He was actually very intimidating back in the day. He was kind of weird and neurotic and tense, not a very huggable guy. You really have to watch yourself around Steve Sondheim. He wasn't friendly. He was definitely not kid friendly, but he changed.
Really?
And he's about to turn 90 next month, and he's still very much among us, and still working and writing. And about 15 years ago, he finally fell in love with this younger man, and they live together, and they have a house in New York and a house in the country, and they have these two gigantic standard poodles, and they have a beautiful kind of huggy life. And Steve changed. His personality relaxed, and he got much more warm and sort of easy to approach. He really changed.
One of the fun things about reading growing up Bernstein, in fact, are all the vignettes of all these other characters. Those of a certain age, looking at you, right? And me, no. Right. These were all real people, part of our lives, and it's interesting to read about them as their history at this point, because there's a moment in life when your life suddenly, you look back and you realize it's become history. It's kind of unnerving. You're not quite there yet.
I guess for me, it'd be Land of the Lost and Slee Stacks.
Okay. But I thought your recall was remarkable. Did you keep notes or a diary or anything, Jeannie?
On and off, I kept journals, and they helped me so much when it came time to write the book. I would have never remembered an eighth of the details that I was able to include if it hadn't been for those journals. And I didn't know why I was writing them. Pardon?
Do you have siblings?
Yeah, I have a brother and a sister.
So because we constantly, my siblings will say, do you remember when, the cow got out of the pasture and that happened, this happened? No, that's not what happened. This is what happened. And another one's like, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened.
Well, if my brother and sister had better memories, I'm sure we would argue about them. But they couldn't remember anything, and I was the one who wrote it down, so my version of events stands. That's why you have to write things.
But you're the oldest child too, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, right. In fact, your sister's quite a lot younger.
She's 10 years younger.
Yeah, I thought it was.
So, my brother and I grew up kind of together in the early years, and then when Nina was finally old enough to see what was going on around her, the whole atmosphere in the family had changed. And it was as if she grew up in a different family, a sort of more troubled family. And my brother and I got the sort of golden early years. And she's quite bitter about that, and I don't blame her.
Wasn't really anything to be done about it, but
well, it's just how it worked out. I can't be taking responsibility, but I get it that she knows that she missed out on a lot of fun stuff.
Well, it's hard to get away from your father in the book, but I thought that your portrait of your mother was really lovely. I'm sorry that I never knew her, because she comes across as just a lovely, beautiful person.
Oh, thank you.
And it must have nearly driven her nuts to be married to your father.
I dare say it drove her nuts. She was determined not to let it get to her, but I really do think it was very difficult to be Mrs. Maestro. When the maestro is out on the road and working, but it's exhausting, yes, but the performer gets all the feedback and the adulation and the return on the energy. So in the end, the expenditure of energy is actually energizing for the performer. But for the companion of the performer, it's just depleting, endlessly depleting, because you're supporting the other person, but you yourself as the supporter don't really get anything back directly from the experience. And so I think it's very exhausting to be the companion.
I thought they did a really good job when they made the movie about Queen. I can't remember.
Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bohemian Rhapsody. That was, I thought, came across remarkably. How he was talented but completely exhausting. But then, had a brief window of happiness towards the end of his life with a with a different relationship. So if you haven't seen it, it's a really,
Yeah, it is a good movie.
it's a very good movie, but just the whole arc of that, I was reminded of it some when I was reading About Your Dad. So your guys and the task force, are they a family unit? And do you have some of
Definitely.
the same dynamics? Because Brad's series, for those of you who don't know it, involves a group of people who all work in something called the task force. So they're like a family.
Mm-hmm. They are, because Pike doesn't have a family anymore, so that's what he's got. He's the only thing left standing for him, so he dedicates everything to them.
So when you write the books, it's actually a family saga, even in disguised as a military
Yeah,
thriller.
actually it is.
But there it is, right?
Yeah, well, and I've said this before, but the very first book I wrote, One Rough Man, was a story of redemption. It had nothing to do with being in the military, but I didn't know how to write a book. And so people always say, write what you know. Well, I was a special forces guy, so he became a counterterrorist commando. But if I'd been a policeman, he'd have been a cop. If I'd been a priest, Jennifer would have been a nun. I happen to be in the military, so that's why I wrote it. But I didn't set out to write a military thriller. I didn't set out to say, I'm going to write a Vince Flynn type thing. I set out to write a Rocky redemption story, which became a Vince Flynn type thing just because of my background.
This has been an interesting week for me. On Wednesday, I had Jack Carr, a Navy SEAL who could kill me with one finger. And tonight I have Brad from Special Forces who could probably do the same, except he's too nice. So there are hazards to being a bookseller that one doesn't necessarily think about when we start out. So you've moved to a new publisher for this book, Hunter
Yes.
Killer. Has your experience been any different?
Actually, it's been the same, except for there's different personalities and different things going on.
Right.
I'll tell you, my publicist is brutal. She's killing me. So, she hid the fact there were literally close to 1,000 people there today, and if she'd have told me that, I'd have said, I'm not going. I'm not talking in front of 1,000 people. That's not happening. But she didn't. So last night I found out, and I was like, what? Yeah, we'll have about 950 people. I was like, what?
They had a more successful ticket sales this year because I think they had a very good lineup.
Because they knew you were coming, Brad.
That's right.
It's the biggest group I've ever spoken to. I was just like, I'm not talking to 1,000 people. I'm texting my wife. Did you hear this? Did you know this? Too late, I've already signed up.
So you're actually scared of women in a lunch?
Yes,
As
exactly.
opposed to military enemy action doesn't frighten you.
Well, I was telling them that you spend, I spent 22 years not telling anybody what I did.
Right.
Because it's all classified. And so I'd be the guy in the corner of the party that never talked to anybody. Just sat there while my wife ran around and talked to everybody. And then you go immediately switch from the light switch goes off and it's like, don't talk to anybody to now talk to everybody. And I had
That's a big transition
Yeah,
for
it's a
you,
huge
isn't it?
transition.
Aren't you lucky you have me?
Yeah, actually I was really lucky. The first time I came here for One Rough Man, it was an interview.
That's right.
So if it had been me standing up there talking, everybody gone, I think that guy's kind of mental.
It's always been an interview. We do it that way because we think it's performance. But back to your dad. I think we all know West Side Story and to a lesser degree some of his other work. How do you feel about Candide? I told you I'd tell you my Candide story because it's
yes,
really
you did.
funny. But tell me what
Is
your
the song,
views
by the
of.
way, I'm not.
It is
No,
off.
Is it off?
I didn't want to embarrass you.
I sensed it.
Sorry. I thought I had turned it on, but there we go. My apologies.
Yeah.
There you are.
Hi, everybody.
Here
I am.
Start over again. Right.
Thank you. Sure. So Candide is another Broadway show. It's actually more operetta-like that my dad wrote, and incredibly, he wrote it simultaneously with West Side Story. Did you know that? They were
I
right
did
there
after
before-
reading your book. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's right. You read it in my book, and there were even some songs that cross-pollinated from one show to the other, even though you would think they're so different that no way one could migrate from one to the other, but a couple did.
So at all times, your father had not only was talking to you and dealing with you and the family and all, but he had all these people running around in his head, singing or making music or something. So he was never actually alone, was he?
No, he hated being alone.
Okay.
But you know, when you're a composer, there comes that moment when you just have to sit down all by yourself with the blank piece of manuscript paper and the piano and pull notes out of the universe and put them where they never existed before. And it for my dad, it was just the most agonizing process. he really hated doing anything by himself, and I think that's what dragged him back to theater all the time, because at least when you're working in the theater, you have collaborators, and so you're not all by yourself all the time. But when the moment comes to write the music, there's nobody else there but you.
Wow, it's like writing a book.
Yeah, sort of.
I mean,
You
at
gotta
the
get
end
back in
it's-
a room sooner or later. You're gonna have to sit in front of the computer and start typing.
Right. Lots of authors tell me that they are happy to have written as opposed to be writing. And I wonder if that was true for your dad. I wonder if he enjoyed having composed more than he enjoyed composing.
Well, I mean, he was happy to have the result in
Right.
front of him. I think every creative artist is really relieved when they have the thing in front of them that they didn't even think they could produce. So that always seems like a miracle of a kind. At least it does to me. Like there's a thing where this is what Steve Sondheim wrote in his song about the hat, finishing the hat. He said, "Look, I made a hat. There's a hat where there wasn't a hat."
Right.
Right. It's true. It's a miracle every time.
Are you going to see West Side Story, the new production?
I've seen it already in previews a couple of times. It opened on Broadway last night.
Right.
And obviously I was not there because I was here. But it's a very unusual production of West Side Story and very controversial. It's edgy and modern, and they use a lot of video, and there's no intermission. It's all one act, and they cut a few numbers, including I Feel Pretty, which is a lot of people's favorite song from West Side Story, so it's controversial.
I was mentioning that my husband's Valentine present to me was to take me to hear Renee Fleming at the Mesa Center for the Arts. And if you were there, she sang from West Side Story and said she was in fact going to be at tonight, I think. No, tomorrow night. She was going to attend in New York.
Oh, okay.
So, good for her. So I'll tell you quickly my Candide story, because my poor husband is not an opera fan, and I have dragged him to opera houses all over the world. He's had some fairly nightmare experiences. We were at Drottningholm Court Theater in Sweden, where the sun doesn't go down until after midnight, and the theater is built looking directly into the sun, and the temperature rises, and at some point a woman leaned over and said to Rob, as people were being carried out, we always lose them, because it gets to be like 100 degrees. So that was challenging. But anyway, we went to Rio, and it was January of 2002. So they had just put in security after 9/11, and the cruise ships were not really ready for it yet. So we're in Rio for a couple of days early, and we're going down to Antarctica, down through Ushuaia and the Drake Passage. And we spent a couple of nights in Rio. We went by the Rio Opera House. Candide, it says, outside. Performance in the night. Because you check in on the ship and spend the night, and then they sail the next day. So I said to Rob, perfect. I said, we can have tickets. We can go to Candide. He's looking dubious, but he's a good husband. So we bought tickets for Candide, and I said, you will love it. I said, it's an opera in English. You will be able to understand all of it. It's a great story, wonderful music. Leonard Bernstein, he's a New Yorker. He's excited, all of it. So the next day we check in on the cruise ship, and they take our luggage to run it through everything. And time goes on, and time goes on, and time goes on, and he's in his shorts and flip-flops, and I'm in something, and pretty soon it's time to go to the opera. So off we go. And we get to the opera house, and they have a dress code.
Oh, no.
So I am in, running pants and shoes, so I can go in, and they have a very elegant drinks thing before you sit down. They won't let Rob in. So he hands me the ticket, because, why waste it, right? And I go in. I have my whatever it is drink, and just as I'm going to head towards the theater, Rob comes in the door, and he's wearing a tracksuit and brand new tennis shoes. I said to him, "What?" And he said, "There was a ball right over there still open." He said, so I had to tree all the way up to the third floor and grab anything that had long pants and shoes. And so he made this heroic effort, right? So the two of us shuffle. Everyone else is in evening clothes and jewels. We go schlepping in and all, and we sit down, and I say to him, it's all going to be worth it. It's going to be wonderful. And the prompter comes up, and they are doing the performance in Portuguese with Portuguese subtitles. So this entire effort was, but he loved the music, loved the overture, and I just couldn't bear to do this to him any longer, so we left at the intermission. So he'll never know how Candide actually played out.
Well, that was really a dirty trick, I must say.
I mean, seriously, Portuguese with Portuguese
And
subtitles?
Portuguese
I know,
subtitles.
I couldn't believe it. So that's my only live performance of Candide.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Me too.
Well, maybe you'll do better one of these days.
Right. So having had a taste of writing, are you thinking of more books?
Yes, I hope this is not my only book, and I'm working hard right now on something new.
That'll be all about you and not
It
necessarily
is
about
still
letters?
kind of about me, yeah. It's not fiction anyway.
Well, it should be about you. I mean, you've done a nice thing for your parents.
Well,
but-
it's my field of expertise.
Which is what?
I actually was thinking that would be a good title, but
I
I
feel-
moved on from that idea. But because every chapter is a different body part, and
That's your
it's
field of
not
expertise.
literally, they're not literally histories of those body parts of mine. But for example, the chapter on ears is about the experience of listening to music. So I mean, it's sometimes it's metaphorical. But
So it's not
always.
medical, it's metaphorical?
Yes.
I'm sure to hear that. Right. I thought your voice was really very, very good and very compelling.
Thank
So did you do this work unassisted, or did you have a writing coach or
No
partner?
way! No, I did it myself. I've been a writer all my life. I just never had written a whole book before.
Okay.
But I had a lot of writing experience, doing articles and poetry, and I write concert scripts and
Yeah.
radio scripts. I've done tons of writing and a lot of editing. So, I was comfortable in the world of writing. But what I did have was a fantastic editor. And it was my editor who really forced me to cut, so that the book would have forward motion, forward momentum, and not get bogged down. And, I think without him it might have been slower and longer.
That's so interesting. So writing a memoir
Same
might
thing.
be exactly like writing
Yeah.
a thriller.
That's what I talked about in my talk today. That if you're writing not only a thriller, if you're writing a story, if it doesn't advance the plot, cut. You can't have anything that's not advancing the plot. And when I originally wrote One Enough Man, I love history, so I studied history, and everything in the book had some kind of history piece to it. Until my editor was like, "What in the hell?" So, like Breach Inlet's in Charleston, it's a very famous inlet. It's where the Hundley submarine went from. It's where the Battle of Fort Moultrie happened. It's a lot of stuff happened there. So Pike's riding his motorcycle across Breach Inlet, and there's 7 pages of the Hundley, and my editor's like, "We don't care about the Hundley. It's not advancing anything. Get rid of it." So I've learned it's not advancing the plot, just like she said. You trim it, forward momentum, keep
And
it
it's
going.
painful,
It
because
is.
these are the
There's
things
other
we
things
love.
you love, right?
Yeah, the expression "killing your darlings."
Right.
Ugh, terrible darling genocide going on in my
So
book.
I was like, people do care about the Hundley. No, they don't, Brad. Get rid of it.
Actually, you're the very place where people do care about the Hundley.
Right.
because Clive wrote a whole book about
Right.
the Hundley. So if you were ever going to find an audience for it, here we are. Why don't we let you all ask questions? What would you like to ask either author?
A quick question, Brad. You said that this is a new publisher for you, for Hundred
Yeah.
Killer. Do you have a new editor now?
I do.
And what was that experience from going from all your 14 other
Actually,
books?
it was surprisingly easy. There was a couple of things I probably were on camera, aren't we? I can't say it on camera. So there's a couple of things we had to work out. He had a different method for, I kind of start the books out, or the chapters out. Sometimes there's a flashback, sometimes you don't know what's going on. You're going to figure it out fairly rapidly, but it's going to start out and you're going to go. And he was really like, "No, you got to tell everybody where you are." And I was like, "This is kind of my thing. This is book 14, and it seems to have worked."
How could he not have already known that, though?
He did. It's his kind of editing. It was kind of his thing.
Did you get your way?
I did. So I did, but for the most part, it was pretty painless because he really trusted me, and I appreciate that greatly. I would have been looking over my shoulder because okay, yeah, sure, you have 13 books out. I don't care. I'm going to send me pages. I didn't get a lot of that, and he's a really good editor, just like my last editor. So if they're saying something, generally I'll look at it and say, okay, there's a reason they said this. What is it? And if I disagree, then I'll go back. But that was about the only thing I disagreed with. The other stuff, I was like, yeah, he's got a point. I got to fix that, and so I did.
And then another question about all your research trips. Have you done the next research trip for your new
I
book?
have. We just got back from Taiwan and Australia for the next book.
Great.
So it might have something to do with China. I'm not sure.
Okay. So a question that came up for Mark and for Jack on Wednesday night was, do you take your research trips by yourself or do you take somebody with you?
Lane has been going with me. Originally, they were just by me because I was going to some really horrible places, Mexico City and other spots, not garden spots. And then she started coming with me. So she was all over Brazil. The only reason we went to the Amazon is because she was there. I wasn't going to put the Amazon in the book until they screwed me with that airplane. So then I shoehorned it in and blew it out of the sky. But that was because she wanted to go to the Amazon. And she's been traveling around for, I guess, the last 4 or 5 books she's done. More than that. 8 books she's been with me on every one of them.
A lot of it depends on where you're going. I mean, Jack pointed out that the places he goes to research his books, he would not be of accommodations of a sufficient quality to interest his wife. But Steve Berry is coming with, Liz goes with him everywhere, so it's a different answer for every author. Anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask? Don't be paralyzed, come on.
I have 100 questions.
Okay, well, one will do.
Well, can you catch us up to date on Mohammed in Harlem?
Oh, how sweet of you. This nice lady is referring to a character in a film documentary that I made about youth orchestras for social change, which is a movement that started in Venezuela, and their program there is called El Sistema. And when I discovered that El Sistema was making its way into the US, I decided to follow a few kids who were in these Sistema-inspired programs. And 2 of them were in West Philly, and one of them was in a program in Harlem in New York City, and that was this young man, Mohammed, who was playing the trombone, and he was so good at the trombone, but he got absolutely no encouragement from his parents, who had immigrated from Equatorial Guinea in Africa, where being a musician was not considered a legitimate profession. And so he didn't want his son to be a musician and was not encouraging him, just wanted him to get good grades, and Mohammed was floundering with his studies, and so it was all very difficult, as you know. And I'm happy to report, well, the bad news is that he left the harmony program and stopped playing the trombone. But the good news is that he doubled down on his academics, and that the experience of being in the harmony program gave him a lot of encouragement and self-confidence. And now he says he wants to be a surgeon.
Oh,
So he's pursuing his studies. By now he must be in high school. I haven't checked in with him in about 1.5 years, but I probably should. So last time we checked in with him, he was doing pretty great.
great.
So that's the good news there. Thanks for asking.
That's wonderful. Why could be a surgeon and play trombone on the side?
He could. I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah, not precluded from it at all. Anyone else?
I was wondering, what was your inspiration for Hunter Killer? What got you kind of going on that story?
Actually, from my last book is what got me going on. I had a tangential antagonist in the form of a private military company called Wagner, which is a Russian military company. It's a real thing. They're in Libya right now, trying to take over Tripoli. They propping up Bashar al-Assad, and I'd done a ton of research on them for Daughter of War, and I still had feeds in my computer every morning. I read a lot of stuff, and I got this feed that said that they'd sent a company of Wagner mercenaries to Venezuela to prop up Maduro. And so I started the research on that, not because I was writing a novel, just because it interested me. I'd done so much studies on the Russian private military industrial complex. And the more I read, the more interested I got. And the next thing I knew, I stumbled into the clown fest of the Brazil elections and the corruption that was going on down there and all that. And it just spun into, that's enough stuff there to write a book about. That's where it came from.
Did you go to Venezuela in your travels?
No. Venezuela didn't enter the book. That was just the nugget of news.
That was the nugget.
started-
So you haven't been there.
No.
You want to talk about clown show?
Yeah, I wouldn't go to Venezuela. I did go to North
Nasty.
Korea. I have no desire to do that.
I'm not sure that all elections are not becoming clown shows. If you really think about the British election, our upcoming election,
Well,
Venezuela.
that one in Brazil was an absolute clown show. The leader winning the whole thing was in prison for corruption. He's still winning. It's like took their Supreme Court to say, you can't really run for president in jail. We're just going to call that. So it was a mess.
Was that Bolsonaro, the guy who won?
That's the one who won. And the reason he won was because Lulu was in prison, who was winning by double digits. The Supreme Court said, you can't run. So his party then threw an unknown out. And when the unknown came out, Bolsonaro just went to the top.
Yeah.
That's how he won.
Oh, well, thanks for
'Cause
that
Lulu-
explanation. I kind of, I missed the details. And
Lulu would have been president in prison if the Supreme Court had said, yeah, he can run. Because he was winning handily.
Did you spend time in Venezuela?
I did. When I discovered this youth orchestras for social change thing, I was so amazed by it that I decided I had to go check it out. The way I discovered it was on YouTube. Somebody had, on Facebook actually, somebody had posted a YouTube video of this very young orchestra with this very young curly-headed conductor playing the mambo from West Side Story. As the encore of their concert, it was clear that the whole concert had been this unbelievable success, and everybody was screaming and clapping in rhythm, and then they played the mambo, and I never had heard the mambo played like that. It was virtuosic, and all the kids in the orchestra, they were laughing and twirling their instruments and dancing around and having the time of their lives and not dropping a note and playing like virtuosi, and I thought, who are these people? And where is my father to see this? Because it's everything he ever meant. The joy of the music and the young people and the fervor and the fun, and it was everything my father ever felt and expressed about music. So I decided to find out what it was, and when I discovered that this was coming out of a program in Venezuela, I thought, all right, I'm going down there to see what the hell this is, because it's either the greatest thing in the world or it's some horrible, rigid Soviet nightmare, and I just have to see what it is. And it turned out to be truly amazing. And Venezuela itself, it was a mess. It was just a collapsing society, but they had this incredible youth orchestra program all over the country. In every impoverished neighborhood, they had these youth orchestra programs where the kids would go after school to keep them off the streets and give them all these, life skills. Because when you're working in an orchestra, you're learning how to literally and figuratively be harmonious and get along and listen, and all these things that really help you be a more evolved human being, whether you decide to be a musician or not. So it's a really good program. And that's how I discovered it. And then when I discovered it was coming to the US, that's why I decided to make my documentary, which is called Crescendo, The Power of Music.
Ooh.
So was that Dudamel?
It was Gustavo Dudamel conducting that youth orchestra, and he wasn't famous yet. And then, of course, later he became the conductor of the LA Philharmonic, and now he's like a superstar. But I sort of caught all this just before it really came onto the radar. Yeah.
Where did the funding for the instruments come from?
In Venezuela?
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that the guy who founded El Sistema 45 years ago talked the Venezuelan government into supporting the program. And so it was the state that was underwriting the whole program, and that's what allowed it to grow and grow from one regime to the other. This founder, who's a genius a diplomat, was able to talk everybody into continuing to support El Sistema, so it just got bigger and bigger and more thriving. So that's where the money came from. And that's why when you replicate El Sistema in other countries, they have to figure out their own recipe for how to sustain it financially, because not every government is going to support a music program. Certainly not in the U.S.
No.
So every individual program has to come up with its own way to support it, and there are innumerable ways.
So this is the centennial of your dad's birth this year, right?
It was in 2018. The
Oh,
bullseye was in
Slightly past
2018.
it. Okay. Do you find with time that evaluations and perceptions of him are changing? That leaves you kind of like one of the few people standing who remembers him, as
Well,
he was.
obviously, the more time goes by, the fewer people there are in the world who experienced him firsthand.
Right.
But there are still a lot of people in the world, as I've discovered from my book events. There are so many people who still had that firsthand experience, who were there, who saw him perform live or watched him on TV and bought the records and watched him, know the shows, all that. There are a lot of people in the world who are still in that category. But in in my father's lifetime, he experienced a lot of resistance to his musical compositions of his own, because if you wanted to be considered a serious composer in the mid-20th century, you were supposed to write 12-tone music, which means music that's not in any key and has no melody. And it's a very kind of intellectual, cerebral way of composing. It's very mathematical, and it's not anything you can go home humming.
Arnold
Right.
Schoenberg.
Yeah, for a start.
Right, I know.
And so, you know, my father knew how to do that. He could write 12-tone music sometimes,
Yeah.
but it was just one color on his musical palette. And he went on writing music that had tunes in it. But as a result, he was never in his lifetime embraced by the musical academic community as a so-called serious composer.
Right.
And so now, you know, posthumously, today's composers look to Leonard Bernstein as the role model for the way they like to compose. They can compose any way they want now. Nobody's going to give them a hard time about it. And so Bernstein is the one they look to for, well, see, he wrote this way sometimes, and he wrote that way other times, and that's what we want to do. So I think my dad got the last laugh posthumously.
It's happened over the years, though, to composers. Bizet Carmen was a total flop, when Bizet presented it originally, and now it's one of the world's most popular and most performed operas. Porgy and Bess was not considered, stage worthy at the Met, and now they've just done a production of it. So it's interesting. And some of your father's life choices were more controversial back then than they would be today, I think.
Indeed, one of the reasons one of the impetuses for me to write my book was to finally find the vocabulary to talk about all these very difficult situations in my family that at the time people didn't have the words for. My mother went through a mastectomy in 1974, and that was way before Pink Ribbons and Betty Ford, and it was still very shameful to talk about breast cancer. You wouldn't even say it out loud. And my mother was an intensely private person, so for her it was like a nightmare to go through this, and it was like she couldn't even tell our sister what was going on with her at first. My sister was, at the time, she was only like 12. And so at first our mother told Nina, well, I'm going to the hospital because the doctor's going to take a little thing off my nose. That was the best our mother could do at first. And eventually she, was able to talk about it. But it was hard. And then, my father was bisexual, and he had relationships with men, which was a thing my mother knew when she went into the marriage with him. A thing we only found out recently through a letter that had been sealed, and then we read it and we went, oh my God, she says right here, I know you're gay, but we adore each other and we want to make a life together and have a family, and let's just do this thing. But that was very advanced for those years. And then there was a moment when my father left my mother for a younger man, and we didn't know how to talk about it. Suddenly our parents were separated, our father was living with a man, and we just did not know how to talk about it. So one of the things I did in my book was to finally find the words to parse that whole complex situation.
I did think that it would have been a very hard book for you to write even 10 years ago. This is called,
What a doggy you are.
right, a dog upstages every other, right?
Well,
There we go. But I thought you wrote that, I thought it was a very brave part of your book, and would have been hard to do.
Yeah, it
Right.
was hard to do. It would
But
have been
would have been
harder not
harder-
to, in a way.
Yeah, well, you couldn't ignore it, but at the same time, I do think that today it's easier to talk about it, definitely.
We
than-
definitely have gone a few more laps by now in that world and talking about situations like that. And so going into the book, I told my brother and sister, look, this is going to get gnarly, and you have total veto power. In this book, I'm going to show you every draft, and if there's something in there that you don't like or you don't want me to talk about, I will not do it. I will take it out or I will change it, so you just let me know. And in the end, they were incredibly supportive, which was great. But my rule of thumb was, as I mentioned last night, the pearl of wisdom. My idea was that in the end, anything that you try to suppress or obfuscate is probably going to come around and bite you in the butt some other way. And that you're always better off just telling it the way it really seemed to yourself, and to tell it in the context of love and connectedness to the people in your life and in your family, and that if you put it in that context, you're going to wind up better off than if you try to avoid something uncomfortable. So that's how I went
I
about it.
don't disagree with that, but you made a really excellent point, which is it isn't just your story. It's also their story, your brother and your sister.
Yes, it is. That's
And
right.
you know, there's I think it wasn't last week in the Times, the whole thing about all this. Maybe it was the Wall Street Journal. I can't remember because I read them all every morning about all the genetic databases and so forth that people are finding out things about their families and how traumatic that can be. Secrets that are revealed, you know, siblings that you either don't really have or suddenly acquire. And, you know, the thing is, it's not just your story, and it can do real damage to other people. I think it's a very tough issue. And I thought, you know, I wondered if your brother and sister, when I read the book, had any input.
Oh, yes, they did.
Good. So,
But they were very supportive.
no, it's great. So it
Did
was
you
a
tell them
really-
you can't remember anything?
You're right.
This is the way it is.
That's right. Lots of times I would ask them, remember that time when this thing happened? Like, was that thing or was this before? And they would just go, we don't remember.
Yeah, but with a 10-year gap, your sister's never going to be able to remember things the same way that you can.
Well, the same way.
Yeah.
That the same way is one thing. At all is another.
Oh, okay. Can't argue with that. I mean, my brother's 7.5 years younger than I am, and as you say, it's really like two different families. You know, there was a whole different economic aspect. He never knew what it was not to belong to a country club and play golf, you know, and I remember when my parents couldn't afford to send me to camp. You know, I mean, you wouldn't think it would make that big a difference, but 7.5 years really is.
Yeah, it's a long time.
Is a big difference, and so it's a different. You know, the family has evolved in that time. So you, as the oldest one, you know, had the longest.
Right. I got
Time
the
with
biggest
your parents.
trajectory, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. Does anybody else have a question before we wind up?
To ask Brad, your background was Army Special Ops, Rangers, Delta Force.
Yeah, I served. I first started out. I'm Ranger qualified. There's a Ranger. There's 3 Ranger battalions in a Ranger regiment. You serve in the Rangers, you are a Ranger. Doesn't necessarily mean you've been to Ranger school. Most of them have, but you're in a Ranger regiment. And so I've been to Ranger school, so I'm Ranger qualified, but I've never served in the regiment. And I was Special Forces, which is Green Beret, and I served in the unit for most of my career, about 10 years.
Like I said, Brad on one side, Jack on the other.
So the background for your stories is drawing on that experience?
It is. There's no. We don't have anything like the task force. It doesn't exist. We used to fantasize about it. Boy, would it be neat if we had something like this? But we don't, because there's Title 10, Title 50, there's United States Code. So at the granular level, you know, at the operational level and tactical level, yeah, everything I've done is going to come to play in the book. Not necessarily because I've done it, but if you were going to write a scene in a grocery store, what would you think of? What was the last grocery store I was in? So when I'm writing a scene about a gunfight or anything like that, I can't help but pull up my experiences. But it's not because I was in Brazil. I mean, I've never done anything in Brazil. It's not because I did anything in Brazil. It's just because it's just any writer pulls out their own, you know, what they know for the book. I just have to know a little bit more because of my past.
How long was your career in the Army?
22 years.
23 years.
So I have a quick question for Jamie. What is your favorite work of your father's?
What is my favorite work of my dad's? I get asked this question quite often, and I usually say that it's whichever one I just heard, because I love them all. I am very fond of West Side Story, and I just saw it on Broadway where it opened last night, so I saw it in previews. And that score does not get old.
No.
It really doesn't. But I have a lot of other favorites too, so depends which day you ask me.
Who was his favorite composer?
He had a few favorite composers.
Mahler?
He, of course, Gustav Mahler, whom he advocated for and conducted all the symphonies and reintroduced to the Vienna Philharmonic and all that, was a really important composer to my dad. But he also really loved Stravinsky and Aaron Copland, Gershwin, and Beethoven. He had a really intense relationship to Beethoven's music.
I got to see him conduct Mahler at the National Cathedral.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah, it was pretty wonderful.
Oh, how great. That's so lucky
Yeah.
you had that experience.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
So I want to thank you all for coming because I know I promised that we'd be done by 7. You have evening plans. So I want to thank our video audience for joining us this evening. And I want to thank Jamie and Brad for taking time to come down here to the store and speak to you. If you'd like them to sign a book or if you want to take a photo and chat with them for a minute,